Director is perhaps best known for his 1941 film classic Citizen Kane, considered by many one of the best movies ever made. But his 1938 radio adaptation of War of the Worlds had many believing a Martian invasion had taken place. Orson Welles apparently died of natural causes today.
He left a unique film legacy headed by the landmark movie Citizen Kane, which he made when he was only 24 years old. Welles' films were loaded with remarkable visual exercises, such as the memorable House of Mirrors finale from The Lady from Shanghai.
Blooming genius on the stage, on the radio, and films, he reached the heights at an age when peers were getting their first foothold. Regrettably, his later years never matched the promise of his early years, but that does not detract from the enormous contribution that he made. From
his innovativeness, his being years ahead of his time, a lot of other people profited from that much more than he did.
In the camera movements, the editing or the non-editing of a scene, the use of soundtrack. The use of soundtrack was extremely innovative. But no film looked alike, no film looked the same after that picture was made, not only in America, but in Russia, and in Poland, and in England, and all over.
Obviously, his influence was widespread. Marty Britt, you directed Orson Welles. We've heard now from Mr. Scorsese what influence he had as a director. What was he like?
Oh, from an actuarial point of view, death is actually closer to me now. It could not be closer than it's always been.
Orson Welles. Hardly a name in film history made such an impact. But who was he? Cinematic visionary, arrogant hothead, enfant terrible of an industry? To many, the name Orson Welles resonates singularly with his first and most famous work, Citizen Kane. Suppressed at the time for its perceived parallel to media mogul William Randolph Hearst, nevertheless, Citizen Kane has survived the test of time as a masterwork. For decades now, this film has topped best-of lists and won outstanding criticism from past and contemporary critics alike. It is, for many, the gold standard of innovation. There is so much literature and research on Welles' masterpiece, and countless articles and imitations, that, in a sense, it's not really interesting to talk about Citizen Kane. Everyone knows about this great work. There's no use in rehashing it. I want to know about what led Welles to greatness. What set up a man to defy expectations and the establishment in all of his works across many decades. Now that's something worth learning about. To do that, we're going to have to hop in our handy-dandy time machine and go back to the year 1915. Orson Welles was born as the second son of two artists in Kenosha, Wisconsin. His father, Dick Welles, was an inventor, while his mother, Beatrice, was a pianist and proprietor of one of the most successful artistic and literary salons in the city. After 6 years in Kenosha, the Welles parents separated, leaving young Orson to live with his mother. She worked hard to foster her son's latent artistic ability. At age 7, Orson had learned Shakespearean soliloquies. At 8, he was playing classical piano and learning to write plays. Tragedy struck at age 9, when his mother died and Orson was sent to live with his father for 2 difficult years. At age 11, Orson's father enrolled him in the prestigious Todd School for Boys, a preparatory academy that allowed him to further pursue his artistic talents. However, just before his 16th birthday, Orson Welles lost his second parent to alcoholism. Continuing his artistic study ahead of all this death in his immediate family, Orson Welles went to live abroad in Dublin after his graduation. Essentially, he was the Bruce Wayne who, instead of being bent on avenging his parents' death through a life of crime fighting, was driven to the arts. So, our boy Orson tried painting, but that didn't really work out for him. Soon, he was visiting all the theaters in Dublin, proclaiming himself as the greatest young actor of America. If there was ever one thing that Orson Welles didn't lack, it was blatant self-promotion. Orson Welles eventually returned to America, where he made his stage entrance to pop culture through, what else, the Broadway stage. Orson Welles debuted on Broadway as Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet, but it was his meeting with producer/director John Houseman that was the stepping stone for his success. Together, the two men formed the Mercury Theater Company, which would come to turn conventional Broadway on its head. Working under the sponsorship of the WPA's Federal Theatre Project, Welles's first production was the infamous Scottish play Macbeth. Orson Welles, 21 at this point, decided to create something visionary. Instead of the traditional English drama, Welles transplanted Macbeth into the 19th century Haiti with an all-black cast. During the brief reign of Henry Christophe, a former slave who became the emperor, nearly all the lines were presented verbatim, except for one instance where Scotland is edited out for continuity. It's hard to overstate the revolutionary nature of this production. At the time, black actors were largely relegated to singing and dancing roles, remnants of the minstrelsy tradition. There were very little representation in actual theater. So Orson Welles, utilizing the classical division of the Negro Theater Unit, molded a cast of predominantly amateurs into stars. Anticipation for this bold new play built for months, and on the opening night, April 14th, 1936, 10,000 people blocked traffic and jammed the theater trying to catch a glimpse of the program. It would go on to tour the country and even entertain the notion of going overseas, which Welles declined for sake of his radio career. As an interesting side note, according to some accounts, a particular theater critic gave an intensely negative review of the play, and as a joke, the crew presented Welles with a voodoo doll of the man. They joked that he should prick the doll with pins as revenge, and it was all fun and games until the critic died soon after. Voodoo Macbeth, as it was called for its implementation of voodoo magic in place of witchcraft, was instrumental to the success of African Americans in theater. Their critical showing to America that they could rise above side parts and tackle great dramatic roles, by and large, was their first debut to theater, and it was a roaring success. But Welles didn't stop there, no. His greatest theater production was still to come. In 1937, after the Nuremberg rallies in Germany, Welles produced a startlingly modern version of Julius Caesar inspired by the Nazis and Italian fascists. Delivered on a minimalist stage, set pieces were modified to give the illusion of pillars of light, evoking the imagery of the Cathedral of Light at Nuremberg as staged by the Nazis. Everyone was clothed in period clothing, particularly black suits and military attire, and the production resonated deeply with the American public's fears of rising Nazism at home and abroad. It was a tour de force of anti-fascism. Caesar debuted on November 11th, 1937, and it was met with unapologetic praise and resounding applause. At times, such as the death of the poet Cinna, the audience erupted in rapturous applause and cheers that literally shut down the show for an upwards of 15 minutes. One of the leading critics of the time, John Mason Brown, was unable to get a seat at the opening night and was asked to attend the matinee show to give it his review. Initially, he was frustrated by the unseemly task. Nevertheless, after Caesar ended, Brown asked to be escorted backstage, where he overflowed with praise for the cast and production. John Houseman would say that it was praise that neither he nor Welles had hoped to hear even in their most monomaniacal dreams. Caesar would run 153 shows up until 1941. It took everyday Americans and their cultural elites by storm. Fascism was brought to the forefront of society instead of its vague abstraction across the sea. Unfortunately, few pictures and videos of this play exist. What we have are the following extant pictures and a David Linklater movie. The latter was produced extensively along the set notes of the original play and recreates a startlingly accurate rendition. Starring Zac Efron as the main role, with Christian McKay as Orson Welles. This film investigates the event of the production while including a contrived love plot. Critically well received, it is an interesting piece of intertextuality and shows the long reach of Orson Welles' influence. Speaking of, it's time to talk about radio and Orson Welles' mark upon it. Welles' radio career was more or less concurrent with the latter half of his theater career. Between Voodoo Macbeth and Caesar, Welles was a highly paid voice actor for various radio programs. He was the voice of the eponymous Shadow in the radio adaptation of the popular pulp series. Something I thought was absolutely hilarious was that once, during a recording of a Spanish Civil War documentary, Orson Welles got in a fight with Ernest Hemingway. It all started when Welles suggested a change to a line about the faces of the dead. Well, little did he know that Hemingway had written it, and furthermore that Hemingway was in the sound booth. Were exchanged, and eventually the two were fighting as Hemingway is wont to do. Imagine it. He was infuriated that duking it out Welles in a radio would dare change one of his lines. Eventually, and this implied is so stereotypical. They realized that what they were doing was dumb, and started drinking whiskey away, and became friends. Nevertheless, Welles' greatest radio accomplishment was the most infamous program broadcast of his time, The War of the Worlds hoax. Welles adapted H.G. Wells' classic science fiction story to a radio show, except he transcribed it in the form of a news broadcast. The hoax claimed that Martians were invading the planet, particularly the US, and Orson Welles described the apocalypse in riveting detail. Here is a brief recording of what it would have sounded like at the time.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmuth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmuth's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Ah, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object, while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening.
People around the country listened to this, and though the reports are often blown way out of proportion, some truly did believe that aliens had invaded the United States. The popular theory goes that the hoax was scheduled opposite to the popular comedian Edgar Bergen's program. Eventually, and apparently during the musical interlude, people started dial turning and came into Orson Welles' program without hearing the disclaimer. Newspapers that were facing a decline in sales sensationalized this event as an indictment of radio. They reported mass panic, and the reality was that very, very few people actually thought the Martians were coming. Americans were unemployed, but they weren't dumb. Across the pond, though, cultural critics, and politicians all had opinions on the matter. Remarking on the gullibility of the American people, critics from the British to the Nazi government were bewildered by their American counterparts. Legitimate or not, this hoax cemented Welles' fame as a daring, creative mind and soon attracted a Hollywood contract from RKO. Orson Welles accepted, and though originally set on making a Heart of Darkness movie, arrived in Hollywood and came to write his masterpiece, Citizen Kane. So that's Orson Welles. He was a genius in many things, but his popularity waxed and waned in his own time. Orson Welles' legacy, though, endures today. He's popped up in bizarre comic book issues
with Superman
and is referenced in literature and movies all the time. It would be fitting, however, to conclude with a segment from the masters of intertextuality and cultural reference, The Simpsons. In a Treehouse of Horror episode, The Day the Earth Looked Stupid, The Simpsons caricature Wells's War of the Worlds hoax with the Second Iraq War.
Please, you must believe me. This is no hoax. This is a real invasion.
Oh, yeah? Why don't I just punch you in the nose, bud?
Nose, bud. Chief, you've got to alert the military.
Fine, I'll do it right now.
U.S. Army, what's the threat?
We've been invaded by a pompous radio ham. How's it feel when the hoax is on the other foot?
I must admit, it's unpleasant. You fool. You've doomed us all.
Tell it to the great Gildersleeve. Ha!
Well, they didn't eat the skin. That's healthy.
Colonel King, your report?
Well, the Earthlings continue to resent our presence. You said we'd be greeted as liberators.
Don't worry, we still have the people's hearts and minds.
I don't know. I'm starting to think Operation Enduring Occupation was a bad idea.
We had to invade. They were working on weapons of mass disintegration.
Sure they were.
I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart.
They call me the hip-hop-opotamus, flows that glow like phosphorus, popping off the top of this esophagus, rocking this metropolis. I'm not a large water-dwelling mammal. Where did you get that preposterous hypothesis? Did Steve tell you that perchance? Steve.